Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the session on online platforms and fairness. I'm Tom Blake. I'm here in the room. We have Jesse Finn is on Gather for us. We're going to be your time cops today and keeping everyone on pace. For those in the room here who are asking questions afterwards, do me a favor. That is your mic right there. Speak up and kind of shout at it. Oh, some of you look too far. No, it's right here in the middle, like third row. Yeah, that was kind of funny. Everyone looked at the far wall. Shout at that mic if you can. For those of you on Gather, if you can't hear the questions, just ask us to repeat it. I'll be giving you kind of time signals, and Jesse will give you those presenting virtually on time signals. And with that, we'll jump right in. So first up is Ed, who's going to be talking about the effect of short-term rentals on residential investment.
All right, thank you. My name is Edward Kung, and I'll be talking about, as Tom said, the effect of short-term rentals on residential investment. And this is joint work with my colleagues Ron Bekkerman, Maxime Cohen, John Maiden, and Davide Proserpio. So let me start by just saying a few words about how this relates to the topic of platforms and fairness, since that's the title of our session. And it begins with what is now quite an extensive literature studying the effects of short-term rental platforms like Airbnb on housing costs. And what that literature has found, and really using a whole range of different settings and a whole range of different methods, is that platforms like Airbnb do indeed appear to have a causal effect on increasing house prices and rents. And the economics of this is really simple. Prior to platforms like Airbnb, the short-term and long-term rental markets were highly segmented. You can think of them as two very separated markets. The short-term being hotels that supply living space to tourists and visitors, and the long-term market as landlords who supply living space to local residents. And of course, that includes people who own their own homes. You can think of them as landlords who supply living space to themselves, right? And so, for a variety of reasons, these two markets were segmented. But what platforms like Airbnb did is they reduced the amount of segmentation on the supply side. And so that made it easier for owners of traditionally long-term housing stock to now supply the short-term rental market instead. And so what this did is it caused some landlords to reallocate residential space away from the long-term market and into the short-term market. And of course, this reduces supply in the long-term market and pushes up prices, right? And so you can think of the story of a landlord who, once the tenant's contract is up, stops renting to that tenant and instead converts his home to a year-round Airbnb, for example, thus reducing the amount of homes available to local tenants. And so it's not just economists that have recognized these market forces. Regular people and politicians were taking notice too. Even before the academic literature started coming out, a lot of people were already pretty unhappy with Airbnb, accusing it of increasing rents. This even led to a number of protests, as you can see in the picture. One thing to keep in mind is that even though the supply side is now less segmented, the demand side between long and short-term markets are still very segmented because tourists and local residents have very different needs. In particular, the need for a long-term renter to have a stable housing situation, right? So it's not like they can just move to the short-term market and roll over short-term contracts, right? That wouldn't really work for them. So in response to the public opinion, as well as possibly lobbying from the hotel industry, policymakers have moved aggressively in many different cities to try and curb the effects of Airbnb. Here are a few examples. Austin, Texas was one of the first movers in this regulation space, actually. What they did is they placed quantity limits on the short-term rental of non-owner occupied housing units, but they did not restrict the short-term rental of shared space. So like if you're just renting out a couch or an unused room or something like that. Washington, D.C. took a similar approach, but they went further. Instead of having a quantity limit, they have an outright prohibition on non-owner occupied STRs. Some cities went with a slightly different approach. New Orleans, for example, has a limit on the number of days you can rent it out annually, as well as an outright ban in the French Quarter. But just to say that policymakers are indeed taking notice of the effect of short-term rentals on housing costs, and they have been responding with restrictions. So in this paper, what we want to do is we want to revisit some of the basic economics of short-term rentals, right? And in particular, we want to investigate the longer-run supply response. It's a well-known fact in economics that supply elasticity is lower, so more inelastic in the short run than in the long run. So we would expect some type of quantity response in the longer run, even if we had a short-run price response, which a lot of researchers are finding. One of the things me and Davide wrote in our first paper on this topic, we actually speculated about this. We wrote, in the long run, we might also expect a supply response. The quantity of homes that are able to supply both the long and short-term renters would be expected to increase in the long run, while the quantity of hotel rooms that are only able to supply the short-term market may decrease. Home sharing may also change the characteristics of the housing stock. For example, there may be an increase in the supply of homes with accessory dwelling units that are optimized for delivery to short-run tenants, with the main unit simultaneously occupied by the owner. And in fact, we are seeing some of this in Los Angeles. There's been a boom in the construction of accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, since 2017. Now, obviously, I'm not meaning to claim here that this entire boom is due to Airbnb. It's not. In fact, there was a law passed in in California, which made it easier for people to build ADUs. So it's really because of that where we had the explosion. But it shows that there was a lot of interest and a lot of pent-up demand for building ADUs, right? And part of that may be driven by the short-term rental story. So what do we do in this paper? In this paper, we're really just focusing on one very specific question, but gets at the bigger picture question surrounding long-run supply response. We're simply asking, do regulations that limit short-term rentals also limit residential investment as measured by the number of residential construction permits? We use two methods to try and get at the answer. We use a difference in difference across multiple cities. You can think of this as exploiting the variation in the timing of short-term rental regulations across different cities. And we also do a spatial regression discontinuity in Los Angeles. Basically, we compare two bordering cities right across the border where the two cities have different regulations with respect to short-term rentals. Just to summarize our findings, first, we find that STR regulations do reduce the number of approved residential permits, and the effects appear to be stronger for housing units like ADUs that seem to be more related to short-term renting, as well as for permit work that we claim is more related to potentially short-term renting. And as a sort of falsification check, we also show that these regulations did not have an effect on non-residential construction permits, which suggests that whatever these regulations were doing is sort of limited to the residential sector. Let me just very briefly talk about the data. So we need data on permits, on Airbnb, and on policies. So our permits data comes from primarily a real estate data company called Share. They supply us with data on 8 million permits. That includes both residential, commercial, and industrial from 2008 to 2020. Although the actual time frame varies by city because of data availability. For our analysis in LA, we get data from the California Department of Housing and Community Development, 2018 to 2019. Airbnb, we combine a number of different data sets, including one of the author's own scrapes, Inside Airbnb and AirDNA. Altogether, we have 1.2 million listings covering 2008 to 2020. In terms of the policies, we painstakingly collected information on the policies by hand for 20 of the largest US cities. For the analysis in LA County, we use the regulation data provided by this paper in the Journal of Urban Economics by Hans Koester et al. Okay, so that's the data. Here's just a quick summary table of the data. We have our 20 cities. These cities all had different dates at which they passed their regulation. 6 of the cities did not pass any regulations until after our data period. Altogether, we have 783 zip codes, 575,000 listings, and 2.2 million permits in our analysis data set. And just to give you a kind of quick summary of the policies, most of the policies, although there's a lot of variation, but we can kind of summarize it like this. Most policies have some sort of quantity limit or outright prohibition on STR of certain unit types or certain rental types. Whole home listings, meaning you rent out your whole home, tend to be more restricted than shared space listings. Shared space listings are like renting a couch or a room. And then non-owner occupied homes, meaning like a second home, are more restricted than primary residences. There's almost always some kind of provisions for public nuisance and safety. Like for example, the owner of the home has to be on call whenever a guest is present. And the enforcement is enforced through some kind of licensing framework, where in order to participate in STR, you have to apply for a license with the city. If you break the rules, they revoke your license and they fine you. We actually don't do much with the heterogeneity because it's just too complicated, too complex. There's just too many dimensions to look at. So the treatment effects that we're estimating are just going to be an average over all the different specifics of the policies that we're looking at. Let me just briefly talk about the methodology for the diff and diff. Intuitively, you can think of this as comparing the changes in the number of permits in cities that passed a regulation to the change in permits in cities that either never passed a regulation or have not yet passed a regulation. Traditionally, a lot of researchers would have estimated this using a two-way fixed effects estimator. Recent work has shown that these estimators can be biased when you have staggered treatment adoption, which we do have. So we're actually going with an estimator proposed by Brantley Calloway and Pedro Santana, Journal of Econometrics, that addresses these issues and also allows us to estimate dynamic treatment effects by group. Okay? Here is a sanity check result where we apply the estimator. So this isn't the main result, but this is looking at the outcome of what is the effect of STR regulations on the number of Airbnb listings. It's a sanity check in the sense that the regulations have to have some effect on Airbnb for what we're saying to make sense, right? And it does. So we passed the sanity check. The effect magnitude says that 12 months out from the regulation, we have about an 8.9% decline in the number of active Airbnb listings. There are no differential pre-trends, which suggests that the parallel trends assumption is satisfied. We also see an increasing effect by length of exposure, but I should mention that this is relative to a secular trend in Airbnb. So you can think of it as just reducing the growth rate of Airbnb rather than necessarily causing it to decline. This is the main result, the effect of the STR regulations on residential permits. The effect magnitude is about 10.8% after 12 months. Again, we see no anticipatory effects or differential pre-trends. I won't get into why, but we think this is reasonable. We discussed it in the paper, why we don't expect anticipatory effects. And the effect appears to stabilize about 18 months out, all right? But anyway, the conclusion is that we do find evidence that STR regulations are reducing the number of residential construction permits being approved. The next thing we do is we try to see whether these regulations affected different types of permits differently. So what we do is we classify permits into just two categories. The first category is what we call new constructions and additions. We're basically looking for phrases in the work description of the permits which suggests that this is either a new unit or it's a subdivision of an existing unit, like putting in a new wall or something. And the idea here is that this is the type of work that we would expect to see if people are sort of getting their unit sort of more suitable for short-term renting, right? Putting in an ADU, putting in an extra room. We do that by just looking for the most common n-grams and then manually tagging the n-grams that are associated with this kind of construction. And then we classify into either new construction additions or other. Then we rerun our estimator on the two outcome variables, and we find that over on the left side here is the result for the new construction and additions, and on the right side is the result for all the other types of permits. And we see a stronger effect on the new constructions and additions, and a smaller and statistically insignificant effect, but if you look at the time pattern, it seems like there still may be an effect there on the other types of permits. But the conclusion is that we also have evidence that STR regulations are having a stronger effect on these new construction and addition types of permits. And finally, we also check the effect on non-residential permits. Remember, we have access to commercial and industrial as well. And here we find no statistically significant negative effect. If anything, there seems to be maybe a small positive effect, but statistically it's not different from zero. But the results suggest that whatever effect these regulations are having, as far as we can tell, it's isolated to the residential sector. Importantly, it means that the results aren't being driven by things like unobserved economic growth, because then you would think the industrial and commercial permits are correlated with that too. Okay, so I have very little time left, so let me kind of speed through my spatial regression discontinuity analysis. Let me not talk about the data too much, but intuitively, what we're looking at is we have two cities. One has a regulation and one doesn't, and they border each other. And we're just calculating the density of permits on one side versus the other. And so spatial factors are controlled for because of the limited geographic space that we're looking at. The only difference across the borders should be their regulation with respect to short-term rentals. We do this for LA County because it's a large geographic area and it's one interconnected housing and labor market, but it does have multiple cities, each with their own local land use policy. So it's kind of unique in that way. Here's the main result graphically. Okay, so the top graph is for ADUs, and we can see that there's a sharp drop in the number of ADU permits on the side with the regulation. For non-ADU permits, we kind of see a bit of a drop as well, but the trends make us not so sure there. We also try a regression with cluster fixed effects. Basically, we group all of our units into geographic clusters where each cluster is centered around a border segment. And then we run a regression with an indicator of whether you're on the regulated side of the border. And then we also include fixed effects that capture all of the geographic variations within each cluster. And these are our results. We find a negative effect of being on the regulation side, as expected. And these results are robust to a number of checks that we did as well, like a placebo test, and it's robust to like the distance bandwidth that we chose. So let me close with just a short slide on economic magnitudes. This isn't in the paper because referees didn't like this part. It's too speculative, and we actually agree. But I think for a presentation, it's still useful. We do a back of the envelope thing, and we find that the loss in permits is about $2.8 billion annually across our 20 cities. Okay, so it's pretty significant. And my time's up, so I'll just end there. Thank you.
We have a question here in the room?
So how did you control for the fact that, I understand you chose two geographically adjacent places, but like, I'm just imagining in Seattle, like, you know, Seattle versus north of Seattle. I could imagine Seattle imposing a restriction because it has more problems with like Airbnb rentals than its northern neighbor, right? So I'm curious whether you tried to control for like the relative shortage of housing stock before in these two different adjacent places in your difference in differences.
Oh, in the difference in difference? We actually don't use that sort of adjacency logic for the difference in difference. Only in the LA, yeah. So with the difference in difference, it's more about timing. So it's about like whether Seattle passed their regulation, let's say earlier than some other city. That's what we're comparing, yeah.
But do you try to control for it for these two adjacent things? Do you try to control for something like this when you're looking at two adjacent places?
Yeah, so for the adjacent places, LA is interesting because it's a bunch of different cities with their own land use departments. But it's like I said, basically one labor market. So the differences across these borders are really just land use policy, things that are controlled by the local jurisdiction.
And did you actually do the like evaluation for like sort of the relative dearth in housing in these different adjacent places? Because I think even though I understand that there are like lots of local municipalities that are
Yeah.
probably small, I think it's probably still worth looking at.
Okay, yeah, we don't control for that, but we could, yeah.
We have time for one last question in the room.
Hello.
Hi.
Thanks for the nice talk. I have a question about the kind of implication of this, like more investment in this kind of units. Does it moderate the price change? Because you would expect people that build this kind of extra units, right? But does it now have any good effect on the price?
I think that's sort of the open question. I mean, really what this matters for is for housing affordability, right? So the question is whether this increase in stock is affecting, prices. Unfortunately, I just don't think we really have the amount of data or the length of time post policies to really look at that yet. And partly, COVID is a huge shock, right? So we cut off our analysis at end of 2019 because of that. And, post-COVID, it's hard. We just haven't looked at it, but I think it's something that we want to look at over time. Yeah.
Okay, let's thank our speaker again.
Thanks.
And, our next speaker is virtual. Jesse.